Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Welcome back to the Ghost in the Museum podcast. This is episode 5. Just a few updates before we begin with today's story. Thank you again to everyone who listened to last month's episode, The Rantan Z. I know I say this at the beginning of every episode, but I really, truly am grateful for every single listen we have. It really is fulfilling a lifelong dream for me to have people listening to and enjoying the things I write, and it does motivate me to keep working on them, keep writing, getting more and more people to listen. All the feedback on the Rantan Z, saying that it was the creepiest and the most sinister yet, that made me feel very happy. That was the vibe I was going for. So I'm glad that I was able to creep so many of you out. It was a bit of a gruesome one. One of you even noticed the connection to the Jeff the Talking Mongoose case. Well done to that person for knowing something that obscure. That episode is still available to listen to. We're closing in on 200 total listens for the podcast, so it would be fantastic if we could pass that milestone by New Year's Eve. I'd be very pleased with that. My second podcast for the Southport and Birkdale Classical Association, it's done, it's finished. So it's just waiting for approval now before it's shared far and wide. I'll share that on the podcast page when it's released. We're all very pleased with how it sounds, and we're looking forward to recording more lectures in the new year, next year. If any of you follow the official Instagram page for this podcast, which is at ghostmuseum_podcast, if you're not yet, you'll have seen that I've announced the titles and release dates for the next 3 stories we're going to tell here. I won't say them here, again you can find them on the Instagram page, but I will tease them with the following phrases: graffiti, letter, and painting. Make of that what you will. I'm very excited for you all to get to listen to those ones. Now, on to today's story. This is another of my newer ones. I came up with the germ of this story about 2 years ago, during a New Year's Eve walk, along where most of the story is set, actually. It's kind of a mashup of 2 or 3 different storylets or mini-stories that I've been swilling around for some time, and it's drawing from a few different sources and obscure true stories. I came up with the title for this episode first, which is unusual for me. The way I usually work when I'm writing is that the last line comes first, the very end of the story comes first, and then I work backwards from there. So this is one of my more unusual pieces for me, I think, in that regard. Finally, just before we get started, I feel I need to include some trigger warnings. This episode has mentions of murder, disability, and suicidal ideation. If you're at all sensitive to any of those topics, please don't upset yourself on my behalf. I forgot to include a warning about some of the more mature topics in the Rantan Z, so I just want to make sure that you're aware that this story has themes which could be upsetting or hurtful, so yes, please don't upset yourself on my behalf. So, without further ado, Merry Christmas to you and your loved ones, and please enjoy this ghost story for Christmas. I call it He Comes and He Goes. You'll have to put it back, said Fiona, with a disapproving look that David had come to expect and resent in equal measure. He returned the stare with an equally withering glance. Why should I? He retorted irritably, adjusting his grip on the large, bulky object wrapped in old blankets that he held in his grasp like a ferret with an egg. Because, Fiona hissed, narrowing her eyes, we don't have the space for it, and we don't need it, and I'm sick to the back teeth of you dragging junk off the beach into the house. You don't know where it's been. It's probably been covered in all sorts of disgusting things. Think of Phoebe. David was already halfway out of the room, gritting his teeth against Fiona's recriminations. But the barb about their daughter stung particularly, causing him to spin around, nearly dropping his discovery and making him stoop slightly to pull its centre of gravity back to his chest. Think about Phoebe. All I do is think about Phoebe, David spat, his eyes swelling with venom. There's nothing else to think about here. Nothing else to talk about. You can't let me have this one thing, can you? This one thing which isn't about Phoebe and all the different ways she could die today. Fiona looked like she wanted to wrench the package out of David's grasp and smash him over the head with it. You selfish bastard, she shouted, jabbing her finger in David's face, her cheeks flushed red with fury. How can you even say that? Get out! I don't want to see you tonight. Clear off to your cupboard and take that lump of crap with you. David clutched his prize so closely to his chest that he could feel its jagged, misshapen edges digging into his ribs. Fine, he spat, spinning on his heels and storming out of the hallway where he and Fiona had been arguing. If there were stairs, he would have stomped up them, but as the specially adapted bungalow they lived in lacked any, he had to settle to kicking the door to the garage open with a crash. The door flew open, and David disappeared inside, and Fiona watched as it slowly curled inwards again. She stared at the space where her husband of 15 years had stood and looked at her with such resentment for a full minute, her breaths ragged and fists still shaking from the adrenaline coursing through her. Fiona staggered through to the dining room, grabbing the open bottle of Merlot from the kitchen counter and pouring it shakily into a wineglass, dark red liquid splattering over the pages and flecking the marbled surface of the counter. Clutching the glass, Fiona sank onto a chair, put her head in her hands, and burst into floods of silent tears. The last thing she wanted was to wake up her daughter, not after she had only just got out of bed in the last hour, had gone through the laborious process of connecting up all of her equipment. It was going to be another long night. David stormed angrily into the garage, flicking on the light switch and hearing an audible clunk as the flickering fluorescent lights buzzed into life. The light in the garage cast a harsh glow on David's furrowed brow as he dropped the misshapen parcel onto his workbench with a resounding thump. The noise echoed through the cluttered workshop, disturbing the plastic celebrations tubs housing remnants of the Blitz rubble that lay scattered on Crosby Beach, the vaporised remnants of Edwardian Liverpool laying in jumbled fragments where they had been deposited after the war as flood breaks. The assorted detritus in the tubs was the harvest of a year's scouring of the windswept beach by David. Fragments of glass windows with wire mesh still embedded, sandblasted fuse boxes, and shards of brickwork inscribed with fading letters. The echoes of times long gone mingled with the present, a reminder of the relentless march of time. As the artefacts settled on the desk with a rattle, David couldn't help but be reminded of the noises of the beach earlier that day. The rumble of loose bricks and stones in the surf, the growling rattle from beneath the waves as shattered brickwork metamorphosed into rounded stones, then pebbles, and finally fine sand. Each piece carried its own tale, a narrative etched into the fabric of the artefacts. He traced his finger over a particularly weathered fragment, feeling the rough edges and ghostly letters beneath his touch. David sensed a kinship with the worn-down stones of Crosby Beach. Like them, he too felt broken, a remnant of something greater gradually eroding away. The garage was his sanctuary, a place where the tangible relics of the past offered solace from the intangible weight of his present struggles. The flickering lights cast elongated shadows as David immersed himself in his work, losing himself in the intricate details of each piece. The crashing waves of Crosby Beach seemed to echo within the garage, a distant noise that carried him away from the turmoil of his domestic life. Amidst the artefacts, David's finger delicately traced the edges of his finds for the day, the pulse in his temples gradually slowing. The harsh light above him seemed to intensify, casting shadows on his face as he navigated the fragments of history laid out before him. A palpable sense of remorse began to creep over him, the first tendrils of shame coiling around his heart. Gripping the sides of the table, he bowed his head beneath the thrumming electric lights, his whispered self-reproach barely audible. "Stupid," he muttered, the word carrying the weight of regret. "Stupid, selfish bastard." The self-loathing tore at his soul, the jagged edges of his past cutting deeply at the man he had become. The bitter, irritated face that stared back at him from the mirror each morning was hardly recognisable to the David of years past. His mind replayed the harsh words flung at Fiona, the woman who had loved him through thick and thin. Phoebe, his only child, occupied his thoughts, as she had every day since the doctors had put the name Rett syndrome on her condition. A part of him yearned to sweep the remnants of old rubble off the table with a crash, to rush out and kneel before Fiona, begging for forgiveness for all his transgressions. Yet, another part, the one that had ruled his life since Phoebe's diagnosis, held him captive in a prison of resentment, self-loathing and bitterness. This wasn't the life he had envisioned a decade ago when he was the curator of the Atkinson Museum in Southport. The small local museum had been a stepping stone towards greater institutions in the north, and life had felt complete in its own way. Marriage to Fiona, the love of his life, and the anticipation of a child had filled his days with joy. But Phoebe's premature birth and subsequent diagnosis shattered that long-ago idyll. Fiona had always earned more than him as a legal secretary. Her becoming their sole breadwinner was the right decision for Phoebe. Having to abandon his career to become their daughter's sole carer still hurt in ways that had never been truly reconciled in David's heart. It wasn't anyone's fault. David's logical mind acknowledged that. Acts of God were beyond blame. Yet, the primal, animalistic part of his brain seethed with rage, casting blame and hatred out upon the world. The life he had envisioned slipped through his fingers, leaving behind a man weighed down by the burdens of unmet expectations and shattered dreams. With deliberate movements, David turned his attention away from the tumultuous sea of emotions within him and back to the table. The large, misshapen object, wrapped in old blankets, commanded his focus. Shaking off the dark thoughts that lingered in his mind, he zeroed in on the curious artifact that had ignited the recent argument with Fiona. A part of him acknowledged her perspective. The object was unwieldy, impractical. It had barely fit into the car's boot, even with the specially adapted space for Phoebe's wheelchair. Normally, David limited himself to smaller trinkets and bits scattered among the rubble of shattered storefronts and broken Art Deco colonnades. These remnants told stories of grand structures obliterated by the Luftwaffe during the Blitz. But this particular object had struck a chord with David. He couldn't bear to leave it behind. As he unwrapped the old blankets, David's practised hands revealed the treasure beneath, a fragment of a Victorian fireplace, around 4 feet wide, 2 feet tall, and a foot deep. The upper left-hand side of the fireplace lay before him, a handsome relic that must once have adorned the living room of a terraced house, the kind that he and Fiona had shared before they had moved into the bungalow for Phoebe. The excitement he felt upon discovering it still sent shivers down his spine, a sensation long absent from his life. The artefact, remarkably intact, spoke of a bygone era. A few hairline cracks marred the decorative glazed tiles depicting what seemed to be water lilies. From the varnish of the mantelpiece to the soot-blackened curve of the grille, the fireplace held the essence of a time when life seemed more predictable, more full of promise. As David gazed at the relic, he couldn't help but marvel at its resilience. It was a tangible link to a past that echoed in the ruins of Crosby Beach. The fireplace spoke of homes that had crumbled, families torn apart, yet it endured, a silent witness to the passage of time. David's fingers continued to explore the worn surface of the fireplace fragment, tracing its contours with a gentle touch. The questions lingered in his mind. "Now, where could you have come from?" he pondered, lost in the mystery of the artefact before him. For almost a year, David had been drawn to Crosby Beach, just a stone's throw from the house, in search of pieces like this. The reasons for his newfound hobby eluded him. He speculated that it was part of him yearning for the days of museum work. He immersed himself in cataloguing and researching his finds, the ring-bound notepads neatly lined up on a nearby bookshelf. When Fiona inquired about his endeavours, he offered vague explanations of working on a book or a paper, keeping his connection to museum work alive. In truth, that precious hour after dinner, when Fiona took over caring for Phoebe, was the only time he felt a semblance of freedom these days. He despised himself for it, aware of the selfishness that clung to this solitary pursuit. As he continued to explore the fragment, his fingers reached the far left corner, to the most interesting mark of this object, the distinguishing feature that had persuaded him to drag it home and ignite the argument he knew it surely would once Fiona saw it. David had overlooked the detail when he had found the broken fireplace, lying on a pile of smoothed orange bricks. He could have sworn that the thing had not been in that spot the day before, and it seemed too large to have been washed in by the sea overnight. Seated on the makeshift bench of a rusted metal pipe, one side of it crushed shut by the force of whatever explosion had torn it from the building it once stood on, he first noticed the dark red mass on the corner of the fireplace. The mark stained the mantel and the first glazed tile, appearing like soot at first glance. Under the harsh glow of the electric lights in the garage, its true nature revealed itself. A dark, reddish hue, reminiscent of a wine stain. Tracing the outline of the splattered shape, David mulled over its origins. Perhaps it was a burn mark, a remnant of molten metal pouring from the ceiling during the fiery destruction of the building. "Wonder what got dripped onto you," he muttered, his curiosity piqued. The artefact, already holding the weight of its history, now bore the additional mystery of this peculiar mark, a stain that seemed to defy the passage of time. A faint sound reached David's ears, a subtle groan of shifting metal, reminiscent of iron plates rubbing against each other. At first he paid it little attention, engrossed in contemplation of the dark red stain on the fragment of the fireplace. But the noise persisted, a distant, dull grind of metal on metal, and a peculiar unease crept over him. He set the fragment aside and moved slowly towards the window on the side of the garage. Pulling up the blind, he rubbed away the condensation gathered on the glass, revealing a view distorted by rain droplets clinging to the outside. The orange glow of a street lamp illuminated the scene, casting sharp shadows. The sea, completely black at this time of night, echoed with the low sound of crashing waves, the only evidence of its presence. David scanned the surroundings for any sign of the scraping metal noise. Silhouetted dimly in the surf, he spotted one of the Iron Men from Anthony Gormley's art installation. The statues dotted the landscape, visible from David and Fiona's house, but at night, only the closest one emerged from the darkness. He studied the lone metal figure, standing half submerged in the inky black sea. The statue, devoid of life yet eerily present, seemed to gaze into the house from a great distance. An unsettling feeling settled over David, as if the sculpture was somehow privy to his inner struggles. He shut the blinds hastily, the unexpected rush of urgency surprising even himself. The garage now enveloped him in a cocoon of artificial light, the artefacts from Crosby Beach standing as silent witnesses to his solitude. David hesitated, his mind wrestling with the disconcerting noise which had now vanished. The once familiar Iron Men took on otherworldly characteristics at night, and David was always eager to finish his collecting before the sun went down in winter. With a sigh, he returned to the fragment of the fireplace, attempting to banish the uneasy feeling that clung to him. He wondered whether Fiona was waiting for him in bed. Unlikely, thought David, not after his petulant outburst earlier. Casting a final gaze out over his futile collection of a broken world, David shut off the light in the garage and headed in the direction of the couch in the lounge for some shut-eye. It would be an early start to the next morning. The room, shrouded in pre-dawn shadows, greeted David as he woke groggily on the couch. His face tingled with sleep, and the pale blue glow of the impending sunrise seeped through the closed curtains. As he stretched and blinked, the outline of a figure beside him gradually emerged from the darkness. For a brief moment, he thought it might be one of the Iron Men, but then the reality struck him. It was Fiona. They stood awkwardly in the dim room, the residue of the previous evening's argument lingering between them. "Morning," David finally said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "Did you sleep?" Fiona sighed, her response leaden and weary. "Not really," she admitted. "You?" David shook his head, rubbing his eyes. The exhaustion was palpable, a heavy burden that both of them carried. He drew his legs out from under the quilted throw and settled onto the sofa. "I'm sorry," he muttered, avoiding Fiona's gaze. "About last night. I didn't mean to snap at you." Fiona sighed once more, her eyes fixed on the floor. "Let's not go over it right now, Dave," she suggested. "We just need some time to cool off." Acknowledging her words with a sound of understanding, David felt the unspoken tension between them. The argument, like so many before it, lingered in the air, unresolved and heavy. "Is Phoebe up yet?" David inquired quietly, attempting to shift the focus. Fiona shook her head. "Not yet," she replied. "I was going to get her up now." The weight of the impending responsibility settled on David as he brought himself to his feet. The image of the broken fireplace from the night before still swirled in his mind. Quietly, he and Fiona walked in the direction of Phoebe's room, their footsteps punctuating the uneasy silence that loomed between them. The journey was absent of words, each step a reminder of the growing fractures in their shared life. David quietly pushed open the door to Phoebe's room, and he and Fiona walked in, barely making a sound. The room was, as ever, filled with medical equipment and brightly coloured stuffed toys. David and Fiona approached their daughter's bed with a practised ease that spoke of countless mornings like this one. Phoebe, nestled among her toys, lay still, her breaths soft and rhythmic. Her stuffed giraffe, a constant companion, was tucked in next to her. Fiona, despite her evident fatigue, leaned down with utmost tenderness. Her fingers gently brushed Phoebe's cheek as she softly called her name. "Good morning, sweetheart," she whispered, her fingers delicately tracing through Phoebe's soft blonde hair. Phoebe stirred, her eyes fluttering open to greet the sight of her parents. A smile and a soft sigh escaped her, as if recognising the familiar faces that promised love and care. The room stood as a testament to David and Fiona's unwavering commitment to Phoebe's comfort. Despite the challenges that her condition presented, they had gone above and beyond to create a haven for her. Working in tandem, Fiona and David proceeded with the morning routine. David carefully lifted Phoebe out of bed, his movements precise and well practised. The couple washed her face and dressed her with a quiet efficiency that spoke to their hard-learned expertise in caregiving. Fiona's voice filled the room, gentle and patient, as she spoke to Phoebe. The joy in Fiona's eyes was evident as she listened to the subtle noises of response, the slight movement of Phoebe's head indicating her engagement. Fiona seemed to find solace in these interactions, a connection that transcended the barriers of Phoebe's condition. David, on the other hand, appeared more withdrawn. A sense of weariness weighed on his shoulders, and connecting with Phoebe seemed to be a struggle. He moved through the routine mechanically, his gaze often distant. The gap between father and daughter, once perhaps bridged by a dream of a different life, now seemed insurmountable. With Phoebe securely placed in her wheelchair, Fiona bent down to strap her in, pressing a tender kiss on her forehead. "Be a good girl today," she whispered, the affectionate words carrying a deep warmth. The room, once filled with the soft sounds of the morning routine, settled into a stillness as Fiona left the room to get ready for work, leaving David to wheel Fiona into the front room and prepare breakfast. The grey day unfolded beyond the window, seagulls circling overhead and long grass swaying in the breeze on the dunes leading down to the beach. Phoebe, parked in her wheelchair against the table, stared out at the sea, her gaze seemingly fixed on the world beyond. David continued to move with practised regularity. He prepared breakfast for Phoebe, emptying the medically approved sachet into a bowl. As he looked over at his daughter, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for the thoughts that crossed his mind. "Are you watching the birds, sweetie?" he asked, attempting to engage with her. Phoebe remained silent, her attention steadfastly fixed on the view outside, her breathing soft and steady. A moment of introspection overcame David as he wondered how much Phoebe truly understood about what she was seeing. The immediate self-reproach that followed made him feel dreadful. How could he allow such thoughts to surface about his own daughter? The memory of his mother's stern words echoed in his mind. "None of us get to decide what our children are like," she had said to him. "You have to take them as they come. You have to, David." He realised with a heavy heart that he had failed to heed that advice. David recalled the emotional outburst after Phoebe's diagnosis, the tears and lamentations that followed. His mother's words had served as a stark reminder of the duties he had as a father. Yet he acknowledged his own shortcomings, the disappointment he felt in himself seeping into every aspect of his life. A sigh escaped him as he brought the bowl of mashed food to the table. He spun Phoebe's chair to face it, drawing her attention away from the window. A soft moan of protest escaped her lips, but David ignored it. He began to feed her with a spoon, the routine unfolding with a quiet sense of obligation. The isolation of his self-realisation, the weight of his perceived deficiencies, hung heavily in the air. As he fed Phoebe, the silence between them became palpable. Fiona entered the room, dressed in her work suit, looking harried and tired. "Thanks for sorting her," she said with a quick glance at David. The routine was well rehearsed as ever, and a perfunctory kiss marked Fiona's goodbye before she headed out of the door. David watched her go, a sense of detachment lingering in the air. The routine "I love you" exchanged between them felt hollow, a phrase worn thin by the passage of time. Neither of them hated the other, but the passion that once defined their connection had dissipated since Phoebe entered their lives. Even in bed they faced away from each other, trapped in a life that had frozen, its milestones replaced by the ceaseless demands of caring for their daughter. The complexity and never-ending nature of Phoebe's care made separation impractical, a fact that fueled the resentment festering within David. The routine stretched endlessly into the future, devoid of graduations or engagements. Life as still and featureless as the iron men on the beach, standing resolute against the ebb and flow of the tide. David contemplated the day ahead, filled with constant low-level engagement with Phoebe. It demanded enough attention to prevent him from pursuing other projects, but never enough to fully engage his mind. Having the TV on was the only acceptable form of stimulation. The silver lining in caring for Phoebe was the time it afforded him to explore television series that had long eluded him. David had always loved detective stories. He'd ploughed his way through all of Miss Marple and half of Poirot in the last year, his second go-around with Agatha Christie in the last 5 years. Right now, he was partway through Dumb Witness, where a dog was the only witness to a suspicious death. He let the familiar narratives provide a temporary escape from the monotony of his everyday life. The television became a portal to a world where mysteries were solved and problems were always soluble through the application of a logical and well-ordered mind, a stark contrast to the unending complexities that defined his reality. Later that day, David sat with Phoebe in the front room. On the floor, Phoebe was engrossed in a mat adorned with flashing lights, one of those toys designed to stimulate disabled children mentally. She happily squirmed underneath, her face occasionally twitching into a grin of delight. David, seated on the sofa, kept half an eye on her while engrossed in a true crime documentary, narrated by an ageing celebrity with a tenuous connection to the subject matter, clearly in search of an easy payday. Unexpectedly, Phoebe suddenly uttered a clear sound. A distinct word. The noise took David aback. Phoebe couldn't speak, and usually communicated through grunts and noises. Hearing his daughter's voice, even for a brief moment, sent a jarring sensation through him. "Phoebe," he called, leaning over from the sofa, his curiosity piqued. Their eyes met, and for an instant, David was certain that Phoebe registered his presence. "What did you say, love?" he asked again, hoping against hope that this might be the breakthrough, the moment when Phoebe could communicate with him. Phoebe, however, remained resolutely silent. As quickly as her gaze had locked onto David's, it was drawn back to the captivating lights. Defeated, David sank back into the sofa. The yearning for a conversation with Phoebe, for the simple interactions that other parents took for granted, weighed heavily on him. That sense of being shut out, marooned in a world that felt beyond his reach, intensified. He turned his gaze to the window, looking out at the sea. The tide was in, the heads of the iron men just barely sticking out above the water. David returned his attention to the documentary, an anthology series delving into historical unsolved murders. Each episode was a glimpse into a bygone era of crime, exactly the kind of challenging programming that captivated him. Deep down he acknowledged that murder in the 1920s shouldn't be any more comforting or twee than a murder in the 2020s, but something about the historical settings and their scandals held a unique allure to him. Perhaps that was why the broken chunk of fireplace from Crosby Beach fascinated him, a remnant of an age that exuded elegance and style, an era seemingly vaporised during the war, along with so much else. The year was 1933. The place, Liverpool, the busiest port in the empire. The narrator intoned, with a dry upper-class accent. David leaned in eagerly. Grainy black and white footage of the Liver building in St George's Hall unfolded, capturing a bygone Liverpool, bustling with horses and carts alongside sleek motor cars. The crowds moved at the accelerated pace peculiar to old films. But underneath the facade of prosperity, the narrator continued, the working class of the city lived in slums, and the striving middle classes teetered on the edge of ruin as the Great Depression bit. Phoebe made a soft noise, her interest in the light toy momentarily abandoned, but David was deeply immersed in the unfolding narrative. A slightly careworn terraced house came into view on the screen, and the narrator darkly declared, "It was in one such respectable middle-class household that a crime would be committed that continues to baffle and appall to this day." A crash of dramatic music accompanied the title flashing onto the screen. "He comes and he goes," in large, white, spiked letters. The room, now enveloped in the suspense of the unfolding mystery, held a momentary reprieve from the monotony of David's daily routine, transporting him from the stagnant reality of his present. A photograph of a couple materialised on the screen, a stage portrait that echoed the formality of bygone times. The man donned a dark three-piece suit, its sepia-tinged hue suggesting a shade of brown even without the photograph's vintage tone. A thin necktie and starched collar adorned him, a pocket watch dangling from his waistcoat. Beside him stood a woman who must be the man's wife, wearing a creased blouse and a long, heavy felt skirt. Both had dark hair, heavy-lidded eyes, and an overall unsmiling air of weariness that seemed to drain colour from the room. "Robert Bruce and his wife Juliet," the narrator began, "had been married for 15 years in 1933. He was an office clerk for the Prudential Insurance Company, while she was a housewife, caring for their 8-year-old son Paul, who had been left deaf after a childhood bout of polio." David's brow furrowed. A curious sense of recognition prickled at him, parallels with his own life. He and Fiona had also been married for 15 years, and they too were caring for a disabled child. An odd coincidence, David mused, but life was full of such peculiarities. The narrator continued, delving into the couple's ordinary life. "The couple lived at 41 Mendip Street, and were known to their friends and neighbours as quiet, hard-working, devoted to their son. Mr. and Mrs. Bruce seemingly had no hobbies, attended no church or Rotary Society. They kept themselves to themselves," one Beryl Finch of 37 Mendip Street would later recall. "Robert is like clockwork. He comes home at 6 o'clock every evening. He goes at 7 o'clock every morning. You could set a watch by it. He comes and he goes. That's all he does." On the evening of October 9th, 1933, the narrator intoned gravely, "Robert Bruce returned home to 41 Mendip Street, just as he always did. However, he would not be seen to go the next morning. He would never be seen to go ever again." David was entranced by the documentary like none he had seen before. There was an ominous undertone in the narrator's words, something that struck a chord deeper than any other crime story he had ever seen on the screen. What had happened to Robert Bruce? David wondered why he had never heard of this case before, considering his proximity and his extensive readings on the great unsolved crimes of that era. His thoughts were interrupted as Phoebe began to make desperate, distressed cries. The realisation hit David like a punch to the gut. He had left her lying on the floor, lost in the documentary, and she was crying with confusion. "Oh, my love," he said apologetically, pausing the unsettling documentary with an image of the front door of 41 Mendip Street frozen on the screen. Leaning down by Phoebe's side, he tried to calm her. Phoebe's head lolled to one side, her eyes spinning in an attempt to focus on her father. She repeated, her jaw clenched, tears rolling down her cheeks in confusion. David, frustrated and feeling a pang of shame, gripped his head. "What is it?" he barked with unintended irritation. Softening his tone, he repeated, "What are you trying to say, sweetheart?" Phoebe shook her head, her body writhing with discomfort. Scooping her up in his arms, David carried her back to her wheelchair, strapping her in and tucking her stuffed giraffe between her limp arms. "There you go," he said, desperation in his voice. If Phoebe had to go to the hospital on his watch again, Fiona would never let him hear the end of it. "You've got Mr. Giraffe, sweetheart. I'm here. There's nothing wrong. You're all right." Gradually, Phoebe's distress lessened, and she returned to her distant staring, her breath settling down. Her head turned slowly towards the TV, to the frozen image of the front door. Phoebe let out a quiet, soft noise that sounded like a shiver. The whole episode unsettled David greatly. What could have distressed Phoebe so badly? He pushed her wheelchair back to her room, glancing back at the screen as he did so, contemplating the mystery that seemed to have gripped his daughter as much as it had him. The rest of the day passed much the same as it usually did. Fiona arrived home at her regular time, and a silent, joyless dinner ensued. Afterward, David took his customary hour to stretch his legs, leaving Fiona and Phoebe in the house. Crosby Beach welcomed him with the familiar crunch of broken bricks and twisted steel rebar beneath his shoes as the wind whipped at his coat, collars clutched against his face. The sun dipped low, casting a burnt orange glow at the edge of the sea, dark clouds forming intricate patterns in the sky. The silhouettes of the Iron Men stood motionless in the surf, a stoic presence against the backdrop of the evening. David's thoughts veered to the haunting question of what would change in the lives of Fiona and Phoebe, or anyone he knew, if he simply walked into the sea and joined the Iron Men. A part of him believed they might be better off without his perceived negligence and self-pity, especially Phoebe. David stopped on the beach, facing the wind with closed eyes, grappling with his despair. Slowly, almost inaudibly at first, another sound pierced through the howling wind. A familiar groaning, creaking sound of shifting metal. The sound he had heard in the garage the night before. It started quietly, and then grew louder and louder. David turned and found himself back at the spot where he had discovered the fragment of the fireplace. As if in a dream, he moved forward over the shattered brickwork. The grinding of metal intensified, creating horrid visions in David's mind. He imagined one of the Iron Men coming to life, its metal limbs clanking forward, like the stop-motion statue from Jason and the Argonauts that had terrified him as a child. Fear clenched his heart, but he didn't dare turn round. Standing next to the heap of bricks where he had found the fireplace, he noticed the rusted metal pipe with its crushed end, resembling a giant industrial Christmas cracker. Fragments of glazed tiles with the water lily designs lay scattered among the bricks. The grinding sound echoed in his ears, blending with the howling wind. And above all, Fiona's voice resounded. "You'll have to put it back," she had said when he brought the fireplace home. Suddenly, the metal sound stopped. David looked around. He was quite alone on the beach, surrounded by the descending darkness. He hurried home, his walk noticeably faster than usual. David sat in the darkness of the lounge, on the sofa again. Fiona still hadn't let him back into bed, and he didn't blame her. They had hardly spoken all day. What else was there to say? The single letter that Phoebe had uttered went unmentioned. There seemed little point in giving false hope. Unable to sleep, David resumed the documentary. The volume and brightness on the television screen were turned down low to avoid disturbing Fiona and Phoebe. All was quiet, except for the distant crash of waves outside. The narrator continued the tale of Mr. and Mrs. Bruce. "October 10th, 1933, he began, "and Robert Bruce is not at his desk at the Prudential Insurance Building. Juliet is not seen to collect the milk by her neighbours. This alone is unusual, so regular were the movements of the couple." A photograph of the empty street appeared on the screen, the houses stained black with pollution. "At around 11 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. Margaret Hyde of 40 Mendip Street, directly across the road from the Bruce household, receives a knock at her door. She opens it to find the 8-year-old Paul Bruce standing stock still. Mrs. Hyde inquires as to whatever the matter is. Paul, unable to speak clearly due to his deafness, gestured in the direction of his own front door and mouthed a single word that Mrs. Hyde could make out. Dead. The screen showed black and white photographs of the inside of 41 Mendip Street, its tatty hallway filled with wonky picture frames and faded, peeling wallpaper. David was wide awake now. Something about this story was particularly dread-inducing. Mrs. Hyde's son ran down the street and alerted a passing constable. Together, P.C. Alan Green of the Liverpool Met and Margaret Hyde followed little Paul Bruce down the dark hallway of the silent house at 41 Mendip Street. As Green would describe in his report, they passed through the door into the parlour and found themselves in the world of a nightmare. David's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen, fear filling his eyes. The strange comparisons to his own life continued. The child only able to utter a single word. The monotonous routine of the Bruce's life before its sudden mysterious interruption. The noise from the beach. The shattered fireplace. Phoebe's utterance. What did it all mean? Was he going mad? There, on the blood-soaked carpet of the front room, Mrs. Juliet Bruce lay dead. Her head had been caved in with such force that fragments of brain matter were later to be found on the ceiling. Her eyes were open and staring at the horrified visitors to the house. Slowly, from the blackness, an image of the crime scene faded onto the television screen, and David's mouth dropped open in horror. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But there it was, literally in black and white. Caught in the bright flash of a police detective's camera, Mrs. Bruce lay face down on the carpet, so soaked in blood that it appeared black. Her head was an unrecognisable mass, and her limbs were bent at unnatural angles. In the corner of the room was the large metal pipe. Unrusted here, its end open. David recognised it now. The funnel of a service duct, the kind used to hide gas and electricity cables. And there, in the middle of the room, intact, looming over the body of Mrs. Bruce, was the fireplace. Not just any fireplace, but undoubtedly, beyond question, the very fireplace that now lay in his garage. There was the varnished mantelpiece, glinting in the flash of the camera, the soot-blackened grill, and the glazed tiles with water lilies on them. And there, in the far left corner of the fireplace, was the dark stain that David now knew, beyond doubt, was blood. David clutched his head in horror and despair. How could it be? How was it possible? How could he happen upon the very fireplace that Juliet Bruce had her head smashed open on, a deed doubtless now done by the vanished Mr. Bruce, just a day before he learned of the crime itself? The narrator droned on and on about the facts of the mysterious case, faded photographs flashing by in a blur as David's mind crumbled from stress and horror and revulsion. The prime suspect, of course, was the vanished Robert Bruce. The killing of wives by their husbands was as pitiably a commonplace occurrence then as it is now. But of the mild-mannered man from the Prue, who came and went from the house with such unerring regularity, there was not a trace to be found. Young Paul could give no account of his father's whereabouts. His parents had put him to bed just as they had always done, but they had not woken him the next day. He had come downstairs to find the scene of horror, and had fled to the house of Mrs. Hyde, as his mother had always taught him to do if he was in danger. If there had been an argument during the night, Paul was a dumb witness and could not account for one. What terrible scene Paul slept through is lost to us now, 90 years distant. David thought of Phoebe, of her lying in bed, crying out for her parents, but both of them vanished from the house, from her life. Who would come to save her? How long before they were missed? He could feel hot tears streaming down his cheeks. How could he ever contemplate abandoning her? He felt sick, his self-hatred crushing within him like the waves on the beach. The house was searched. Liverpool Metropolitan Police issued an appeal for information, and then a cash bounty. For a week or more, Robert Bruce became the most wanted outlaw in the country. An image of the wanted poster flashed on the screen, the glum-faced Mr. Bruce appearing alongside his personal characteristics, the legend, "Murder Most Foul," emblazoned beneath his photograph. But Mr. Bruce was nowhere to be found, and to this very day, he has never been found. No trace of the first and only suspect in the brutal slaying of Juliet Bruce has ever been uncovered. In the words of the Chief Constable, it was as if Bruce had walked into 41 Mendip Street that night, put his son to bed, slain his wife in the most gruesome manner imaginable, and then had quite simply dissolved into thin air. David was standing up now, pacing about the room in panic. What was he going to do? Fiona's words echoed in his ear again. "You'll have to put it back. You'll have to put it back." Why didn't he listen to her? The programme was drawing to an end now. The house on 41 Mendip Street was destroyed in the Liverpool Blitz in 1940, and any evidence that remained undiscovered within was lost forever. Paul Bruce died childless in an assisted living home in 1997, aged 72, having never discovered the identity of his mother's killer or the fate of his father, forever tarnished as a murderer. As for the so-called Bruce mystery itself, it has fascinated and confounded detective novelists and amateur sleuths ever after. It was impossible for anyone except Robert Bruce to have perpetrated the heinous crime. It was impossible for Robert Bruce to have escaped the house unseen. He was the man who came and went, until one day he came and was never seen to go again. The credits rolled on the documentary, and the screen faded to black. David lay in the darkness, his mind shattered like the rubble on the beach. "You'll have to put it back," Fiona's voice echoed in his ears. It was another blustery grey day at Crosby Beach. The sky was clear, the sea stretching off far into the distance. The tide was out, and the Iron Men stood resolute at attention. The large white car pulled up in the concrete car park, empty except for the lone ice cream truck that seemed to stay parked there in all weathers. The door opened, and David slinked out, looking furtively about the beach. They were alone. He hurried around to the back of the car and opened the back door. Phoebe sat in her wheelchair, strapped into place. He had made her as comfortable as possible, putting her in a coat and scarf and tucking Mr. Giraffe under her arm. David knew that Fiona didn't like taking Phoebe out at this time of the year. The previous winter she'd caught a chill at the park, and the subsequent chest infection had landed them in Aintree Hospital over Christmas. But he didn't dare leave her alone in the house, not for 10 minutes. David knew he had to do this now, before Fiona got home. "Let's go, sweetheart," David said breezily, trying to keep his cool. "We're going to go for a walk on the beach and see the birdies." Phoebe groaned, squirming with discomfort. Her face seemed contorted with worry at the unfamiliar break in her routine. Regardless, David unshackled her chair from the car and led her down the ramp. Parking her on the concrete, he scrambled back into the boot and awkwardly extricated himself backward, pulling the lump of shattered fireplace out with him, wrapped up in its blankets. David shut the boot and, clutching the misshapen package close to his chest with one hand, pushed Phoebe forward with the other, trying his best to shield her from the grains of sand blowing in the wind. David pushed Phoebe along as far as the concrete path would take her. They paused at the end of the path, where the shattered bricks began and stretched off over the horizon. Phoebe was still squirming, twisting, her jaw clenching and unclenching as if she was about to retch. She groaned, her face screwed up in anguish. David heaved his heavy package to the floor and leaned down next to her. "What is it? What are you trying to say?" He yelled over the howling wind, gripping the sides of Phoebe's arms. She stared, wild-eyed, past David's shoulder, out to the sea where the Iron Men stood. She said with urgency, as if desperately willing her father to listen, to understand her just once in her life. David was beside himself with stress and panic. He glanced over his shoulder. No one was around. He could see the rusted metal pipe not 50 yards away. He stared back at Phoebe. He had to get her home. She looked like she was on the brink of a seizure. David cursed to himself. "Sweetheart," he whispered, pleading for Phoebe to understand. "I'll be right back. I'm just going right over there, and then I'll come right back. Do you understand? I'll come back." David scooped up the fireplace in his arms and dashed off onto the beach, the bricks crunching beneath his boots as he pelted towards the spot where he found it as fast as he could, carrying the heavy lump of stone and tile. Phoebe's distressed noises were soon lost in the howling wind. David screwed up his eyes. He had abandoned her. The one thing in his life he had been told not to do, that he knew he could not do. His hobby had distracted him from his care of Phoebe in ways he had never intended it would. David made it to the spot where he had found the fireplace, but as he fumbled the blankets it slipped from his grip. The fireplace dropped to the ground and split apart with a crash. The tile, with the bloody stain, bounced into the air, seeming to glint for a moment before him, before crashing to the ground and shattering into pieces. He stared at the broken remains of 41 Mendip Street around him, the last lingering vestiges of his logical categorising mind, trying to make sense of the chaotic, meaningless jumble. The grinding metal noise was back, louder than ever, threatening to overwhelm him. "A man walks into a house," David thought to himself, "and he never walks out again. Where does he go?" Slowly, terribly, David's eyes drifted past the fireplace, to the rusted pipe, and a dreadful, curdling feeling rose in his stomach. He moved slowly towards it, and kicked the side of the pipe. It clanged, and rattled. He reached down, mechanically acting out the end of the great mystery, and pulled the rusted door of the pipe from its hinges. He peered into the black cavity of the crushed pipe. A gleaming white skull grinned back at him. A heap of bones in a rotted three-piece suit. A rusted pocket watch glinting dully amid the decayed heap of Robert Bruce's corpse. "Where does he go?" David thought to himself. "He doesn't go anywhere. He stays in the house. He kills his wife. He climbs into the pipe. He gasses himself to death. He's sealed in by the bombing. He's dumped on the beach. He gets away with murder. He's never, ever found." The grind of metal on metal stopped, and David just had time to register the shadow of the human-shaped figure behind him, and the fact that the remains of the blood-stained tile had disappeared, before the back of his head exploded, and he never thought anything ever again. The past 3 months had been a tumultuous time for Fiona. She recalled even now the panic she felt when she came home to find both David and Phoebe missing, the overwhelming relief when the police assured her that Phoebe was safe, that she'd been found by the driver of the ice cream van on the beach, coupled with a seething rage at the realisation that David had once again abandoned his responsibilities for his obsessive pursuits. In the immediate aftermath, Fiona had been prepared to unleash her full fury on David when he returned from his beach excursion. But he never did come back. The police search yielded no clues, but the absence of the large package he had brought back days earlier suggested that he might have taken her angry words too literally. The day turned to night, days to weeks, weeks to months, and David never returned. Fiona wept for the man she once loved, but her sorrow was mixed with frustration and anger at his irresponsible actions. Phoebe, unable to comprehend the absence of her father, added another layer of heartache to Fiona's already troubled emotions. With the help of her parents and brother, who had dropped everything to come and help her, Fiona managed to navigate the challenging days. Carers were arranged for Phoebe, allowing Fiona to keep her job, yet the ghost of David lingered in the now half-packed bungalow, a stark reminder of a life that had broken apart like so much shattered masonry. Fiona had made the decision to move away from Crosby, back to Manchester, closer to her own family. David had no family of his own left, his mother having died years earlier, and with his inexplicable disappearance presumed lost at sea, there was no reason for her to stay in a place that held so many painful memories. The bungalow echoed with the sounds of packing, a tangible sign that life was moving forward, albeit without David. The move would have to wait. Today was a special day for Phoebe. After years on a waiting list, today she was finally receiving her voice synthesizer. She'd been practicing for months, painstakingly using arrays of flashing lights and mentally stimulating toys to learn which buttons to press to actualise her thoughts into words. Fiona crouched next to Phoebe's wheelchair as the engineer finished installing the keyboard and the computer. "There," said the engineer, as she flashed a reassuring smile at Fiona and Phoebe. "You're all good to go." Fiona beamed at Phoebe, who was contemplating the keyboard with a focused expression. "Here we go, sweetheart." Fiona smiled at her daughter, rubbing her leg. "Just take your time. We can't wait to hear what you have to say to us." Phoebe made none of her usual excited noises. She'd been disconcertingly quiet ever since the day she was left on the beach, and Fiona had been worried about what distress she had been unable to express. She didn't know how much Phoebe had seen about what had happened to her father, much less how much she understood. She had hoped that the synthesizer would provide some much-needed relief. Slowly, each key pressed taking a supreme effort of concentration, Phoebe began to type out on the keyboard. A flat, electronic voice emerged from the computer, and Fiona heard the voice of her daughter for the very first time. "He's coming," Phoebe said through the synthesized voice, her eyes drifting away from her mother and the engineer, over the disassembled furniture, and out through the window to the sea. "He's coming for us. He came for Daddy, and he got him. He won't ever stop. I saw him. He lives in the sea. He came out of the sea, and he went back in. I saw him a long time ago. I tried to tell Daddy. I'm sorry. I tried to tell him. I saw him outside my window last night. He wants to come in. We have to go. He took Daddy's head with him. He's coming." As the distant, echoing groan of metal on metal was carried by the wind from the sea, unseen by anyone, a dark figure emerged from the surf and began to move towards the shore. "He Comes and He Goes" was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod. The script editor was Jennifer Rhiann Bartley. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new original story on the 29th of January. Thank you for listening. Merry Christmas. May we meet again.